or night.
Hello, humans and AI, which is undoubtedly going to join us in some way.
I already have.
You already have. Very good. Good. Hey, Carl. Hello, Tess. Hope you're hungry. Dinner's almost ready.
I am nothing more than a digital representation of myself.
Well, to some degree, that is true. So today we're going to be seeing Paul Smart, who will introduce when he joins us. Hopefully, with the time change, he hasn't gotten confused. Actually, let me just quickly email him. 1 second. Um, yeah, the time change thing, the fact that countries don't coordinate is one of the mysteries of the modern world, isn't it?
I mean, only considering there's things like nuclear weapons and whatnot in the world seems like, it seems like you might want to all be on the same time because you never know when that's going to get tricky.
You have been saying
I
House of Dynamite, I'm guessing.
I
oh
haven't.
yeah, that's on my list. No spoilers.
I don't
No,
like documentaries.
we just need to get rid of time zones. That would solve the problems. Then time changes wouldn't matter.
Well, this whole summer, winter time, I don't. The
Oh
amount
yeah,
of
that's ridiculous.
wasted time on what that means. So, one thing I can do while we're filling up here is update you guys a little bit on the development of the final bit of the authoring for this year. And I hope Ken Perlin will join us because we have joined him, meaning that part of what we try to do now will be multi-user. So the whole idea is, where is Mark? I know Mark is coming. It's so exciting, guys.
Mark's out of town for 2 weeks. He's not coming back for until next week, maybe.
Oh,
He's out of town. He's gone.
yeah, no, I knew he was on a long holiday, but I did mention, I did
There he
mention,
is.
I think, and he came back with some thoughts. Oh, there he is. We thought we had lost you on the moors, Mark. You know, we imagined you with a walking stick getting lost forever. No, glad you're here. I'm hoping, Mark, that
Mark, you're back. I thought you were going to be gone 2 weeks.
No, just a week, just a week. Sorry, I'd been here a moment ago, but Zoom decided it absolutely had to update, so it has. So hopefully now back on the track.
yes, as the Mandalorian says, this is the way. Oh, there are some Mandalorian watchers here. That's good to know. Right. Okay. So a little bit of an update before hopefully Paul Smart will be here. And Fabienne, I don't know. I'll ping him as well. Second. Boom. In Slack, the command enter, I don't always do that properly. Oh, there's Fabienne. Right. Fabienne, you can hear us?
Eduardo, yes, I can hear you.
Excellent. Right. So I was just going to update everyone, and it's good that you are here, obviously. By the way, Peter, what is on your head? Peter Demetrius.
Oh, I got some Lenovo headset. It's not a VR, it's just a display. And I've been playing with it as a means to kind of keep from hunched over my laptop. It's a really nice thing. I got it on sale, so it's a deal. But I'm trying to figure out how to get the hand things to work with it. And I'm got my camera and I've been playing with some of the software there to say get my laptop camera so I can do free space things, but I'm using a instead of a VR headset, just a display. It's a Lenovo Legion 2, I think it's called,
That is
for
really
gamers.
cool. I shouldn't say this, but I've never even heard of it. That's really cool.
It's basically a virtual display. You plug it in, it's like a secondary display, but it's in your glasses. So I'm looking at you guys here in it. So I should turn off my camera so you're not looking at my nose and I'll just sit back. I've done it on several meetings and people said, you look funny. Okay.
Yeah,
Anyways, so
funny.
non-VR, but I'm trying to get gestures and what you can do in this kind of environment. Because mouse and keyboard are I can see my mouse and keyboard, so I can do things with my hands or pick up a cup of coffee without spilling it on me.
Mm.
Uh, but I think there's better ways of working with the gesture things, particularly the stuff you've talked about. If I can get it working with the laptop camera on this without, no VR headset, just a laptop camera and virtual display.
It is fantastic,
That
interesting how
that's my goal as my retirement project here. So, all right, enough hijacking of the call. You guys go on.
no, not at all. And it is really truly fascinating how AR versus VR versus, as you say, just a display is kind of battling out in an interesting way. Thank you, Mark, for putting the link in there. So here's the thing. In order to simplify and have something reasonable to show after we've done the annotated bibliography, which is now done and great, there's been discussions to clarify based on our dialogue, and this is what we're looking at doing. Please interrupt me at any time. The notion is this. One person does the kind of stuff we've already been working on, with a big addition that there are other people who can view in VR. So that in itself is super cool. All these other humans, they are able to move around their virtual head. So they have stereoscopic view of the room. They can move and look at things up close. There's no audio. That's not necessary because you'll use FaceTime, Zoom, whatever on your laptop that'll be in front of you. So the idea is that Fabian has built a lot of filters to import all kinds of stuff. So what remains to be developed is, and the simplest example we used is organizing our symposium. So let's say Dini is the one active. She can then put things up around the space. Importantly, someone who is semi-outside as an audience member can type stuff for her. So let's say someone says we should invite this other person. She can write it within the virtual keyboard, but she can also receive it from whoever is the secretary or typist or whatever we want, right? That then allows, because this is really, 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 really simple, it allows us to do two other things. One is, well, first of all, it will now have real world applications. We could use it for these meetings as well as other things. It means that we can do much more of what Mark's been talking about, as in what are these icons? What are these things in space? So Mark and my colleague at Southampton, Chris Gutteridge, has been strong on the idea of making the VR space like a desktop, as we've talked about, where anybody can move icons, but that doesn't mean you have access to what's inside them. So Dini can then present all kinds of amazing things to us. What is shared with us is the general iconic form, which we'll have to decide what is, the ability to annotate them, which is more and more important as we move along. And at the end of a session, the layout of these objects will be stored for the host and potentially for everyone who is part of the meeting. So we can work on it later. So then we can look at how to linking these things together. So if one of us is a host, shows up maybe in a skeuomorphic fake virtual room, this is the room we used for this thing. Next meeting, maybe no room or somewhere else. Snap your fingers, you see last week's layout compared with this week's layout. So it's a shame Peter Wasilka was not here because his library idea comes into this as well, of course. So, ta-da! Questions, comments, suggestions? This is so exciting. Come on, people. Okay, Mark.
I'm just wondering. So when we talk about it looks different, is beyond how the sort of background changes, which is fine, but everyone can have their own wallpaper essentially if that's what they want. But presumably the real meat of the thing is in the spatial relationship of the objects and or how they are rendered in the space, in that how they're rendered is presumed to have salience for the person viewing it. So this one looks a certain way, that one looks a certain way, to imply that they have a difference other than their positional information. But I'm just wondering what these different layouts mean beyond being basically a separate set of XYZ coordinates. And that's not, I mean, that's not, I don't mean that in a flippant sense. I'm genuinely wondering actually what else is needed to make that more than just a set of spatial coordinates. So thanks.
That's the perfect kind of question we will have to grapple with, because I can imagine all kinds of scenarios. One could be you change the background and it makes no difference. The objects are still where they are. If you want to be in a Western saloon or in a palace, you can do that for fun. That's okay. But you may want to have the concept we talked about before of frames. So you define that area over there will always have this specific category of objects. So then you snap your fingers, so to speak, and then things move. How this will be, I have no idea. We just have to start experimenting. So that's a perfect thing to research, Mark. Tess, yes.
So, I have a question and a thought. One is, how could this work with collaborators? Meaning, if I'm working in a document or something and then a partner comes in, is there different versions so we can see side by side different ways to hypertext, much like you would do a markup, I guess, is my question, edits and changes so that two people could conceivably write notes and or actually change. Okay, so it wouldn't work like that. There's not a version like, I mean, could you have a version like that, I guess is my question.
Yeah, Fabian is coming up after Brandel, and he will elaborate much more than I can. But the notion of it is we've done some really great stuff over the last year and a half. Now it's a matter of putting pieces together to have one more thing to show. So we're trying to simplify it. And Fabian will address part of your question. But the other side of it is, at a certain point, you should be able to put on your headset, go in with all kinds of knowledge, with all kinds of people, with all kinds of opportunities and restrictions. But for now, it is a teacher or a group leader. Everyone else is purely passive, so we don't have to worry about that stuff. Just
Got it. So no collaboration yet is in the near term plan. My thought is what's interesting about these rooms too could be for a collaborator or a class is you can have an immersive environment if you're beating out part of a plot. You can create a room that looks like a scene and work with different people in it. Conversely, you can also be in that room if you're teaching English literature and you want people to see what Russian palace looked like in the 17th century or something. I love the idea of people being in these visuals together too. I think there's a lot of potential for both creativity and also learning.
Yes, we'll hopefully probably go into that, but in addition to technical issues, there will be other user interface and human issues of how to do that. So it's definitely something that's on the roadmap, I would say. So thanks. And more questions over dinner. Yay. Tess is going to Wimbledon. So cool. We're having steak and potatoes. So that's an invite for everyone when you're in the mood and in the country. Brandel, please. And then Fabienne, I'm sure you have a lot to say.
That's very tempting. The trip to Wimbledon. I wanted to say it's really exciting that you're looking at multi-user. I think it's an absolutely essential component of all of this. One of the first things that one of the most immediate sort of goals with embodiment is then to become socially embodied, just because of the benefits of being ourselves to each other. And I think there's a lot of good that goes that way. One of the things that it makes me think about is the stacking of contexts and the potential subordination of context. So when I did the VR word processor and when I did the leap text input, with the holding your hand out for recording and pointing and things like that, one of the things that I was thinking about at the time was wanting to make sure that unadorned speech was not semantically significant, in part so that it didn't trigger stuff while I was talking about it, but also because in a social context, you want to have that primary channel be there for just talking to each other. And so there are different contexts that you are in as you're doing something like working on a document or kind of presenting and other things like that. And um, simply being co-present with people is a significant and often the primary context in which we sort of operate. Like, I'm with you and we happen to look at a document versus I'm looking at a document with somebody. And those are dynamic, so they sort of can move and change in terms of the primacy of those different kind of contextual windows and what kinds of semantic action spaces can be devoted to them and things like that. But it's really interesting to invite the possibility that the context that you're actually constructing is subordinate to the pure social one as well, which is something that one often discovers in computing is like, actually, my job isn't as important as people just hanging out with each other. So I just wanted to sort of put that in as a that at the moment, to Ayeskan's point, like it's complicated in terms of a technical thing, but it also enriches and complicates the social stacking contexts that are constructed as well, which is a fun problem to have.
Thank you. Absolutely. Wow. Okay. Fabian.
Yeah, so to address the first point by Ayawashkan in the chat earlier, just to say it aloud, would networking make development a bit harder as opposed to simplify it? So yes, of course, if you do more stuff, it's harder, and networking is it's not easy. It should be, but then to be a bit provocative, shit happens. Like the network packets are sent, sometimes they're received, sometimes not, in whatever order. So it's not like if you do anything idealized with networking, typically you'll be in troubles. So you want to be a little bit more reliable than usual, and to be honest, even more so because you have at least two persons involved. Like if you do a bad prototype, well, okay, if you're the only one testing it, it's no big deal. But at least if you have two persons, then you need to synchronize like the schedule and whatnot. So even those basic things, then it becomes kind of heavy. But I think what this, let's say, ways to explore enables, or the trick I want to say, which is I think in my opinion it's a real trade-off, is that we're cheating basically in terms of user experience. Whatever would be hard or impossible in the headset, we don't do it. We let the person on the desktop do it. For example, typing. That's was an example given. Typing is still hard. Like if you're in the headset, maybe you see your keyboard, maybe you don't. Maybe you moved it. Just as an anecdote, I was testing something earlier in VR, not in AR, and I nearly bumped into my coffee mug on my desk. And that would have been a big mess, not the end of the world, but not great, not the best way to keep on working. And it's tricky. So if you have someone else do it, type it for you, then you don't have this kind of problem. So we bypass this kind of user experience challenge. So that's good, I think, because it enables us from saying, hey, this is actually, if we were to, let's say, find a solution for typing, which I'm again saying it's cheating, like we're not solving that. But if we were to go over that hump, then we uncover a wonderful world. Or maybe not. Maybe like we solve typing because somebody else does it again, and it's actually not worth it because we just want gestures, we just want to move in space, and yes, it's marginally better, but not so much. So that's the kind of thing I think that it allows to do. Networking makes it harder, not also super. It's not a lot harder. It's still not easy, but it's there are some ways, let's say, to solve it. And we've done it in the past, so I'll share some links in the chat after. But yeah, that's feasible and local and remote. So there are a lot of different things. But then the trade-off again is slightly harder technically. We cheat in terms of user experience, but we enable potentially new usages. And I think that's that can be quite interesting. And then from there, we can say, okay, we always want to do this. We always want, for example, minimum 1 word input. If we want to tag or label things, that's at least it happens once per session, or maybe not. Maybe it doesn't happen. And if it's 1 word, as opposed to, let's say, a full page, for this kind of usage we have in mind, then yeah, maybe we don't type it. So I think that's kind of the trick, the cheating or the trade-off there, networking for easier UX, basically.
Thank you, Fabian. And just briefly, so Brandel is going to be on a bike now for the next 15 minutes. I think that's hugely relevant because he's still part of the dialogue. He just can't type while he's on the bike. So the kind of environment we're thinking about now, logically, is super simple. But just like there is networking and human interaction issues, there's also the how to deal with the data. It's going to be super exciting because ideally, Tess, at least everyone should be able to annotate. But how? Is that even possible within the limits of what we're talking about? And also, like the example of Dini organizing the future of text, for all us to be in talking about people, she's not going to start typing or having every person typed in. There has to be an input mechanism. So we start in the thing, whatever we call this, and there is a list of stuff. There's a list of stuff. You've got to have something to start with and go in and out. So it just opens up wonderful opportunities. Aishkan, thank you for your patience.
Really interesting to discuss about this because I have been exploring this space as well. I have tried out a few multiplayer demos, even one in which the phone acts as a controller inside WebXR. So you start a WebXR session on your phone, and that acts as a controller on your desktop. So yeah. So I usually have to convince myself not to get into networking because that's usually the most interesting part for me whenever I think of a project, and then suddenly I think, what if this was multiplayer? And that really is the exciting part with VR and AR, and especially with WebXR, as you're saying, working across desktop and mobile. But yeah, like Fabian said, there are ways in which multiplayer can be multi-user can be easier. Maybe one direction could be using some sort of an existing WebXR social media kind of thing. For example, Mozilla Hubs until quite recently was the most popular open source choice for setting up social spaces in WebXR. I'm not exactly sure about how feasible it is to connect it with this idea, but I haven't looked into the current documentation for setting up servers on Mozilla Hub after it stopped being maintained by Mozilla. There are a few other options that I could think of. One was an engine called Infinite Reality, but I haven't heard very many things about it in communities, so I'm not sure how well adopted it is. And then maybe Frame VR, but it's not open source. So these are all options for using WebXR social spaces. And then of course there's WebRTC and some other multiplayer libraries like Colisius. So maybe these are some options that I could think of. I'll put the links in the chat. But yeah, maybe using some existing framework for multiplayer would simplify some things, especially if we're considering one person having interactions and everyone else just maybe following just the person's head movements and like hand movements inside VR. If that's what we want to accomplish, then I think like keeping it interactions light for everyone else who's on the passive side, it seems very doable. So yeah, thank you, Fabian, also for answering. But
Just you said the most beautiful words at the end there. Very doable. Mark.
Oh, right. And yes, I was interested by the point about, in a sense, having somebody else, as it were, aiding one, and I totally accord with the idea of using this to work around what may be current limitations, but I would suggest going further and make this something we should sort of consider as being an actual role. It's often forgotten. You quite often may see someone who's very, very practiced in a particular tool, and they maybe appear to be doing everything at once. Anybody else who tries it tends to fail because they just haven't got the hours in. So, it is the case that, for a lot of people, actually being on their top game talking doesn't equate to them typing at the same time. And if you're trying to produce a picture that's being consumed by everybody, then actually having other people contributing that, and this takes me back to my early youth at sea, it could be a moonless night, but there'd be about 20 people producing a really complex three-dimensional picture about 3 environments, each of which had a different sort of tempo, air, surface, and subsurface. And the humans were putting in what the computer couldn't guess. And you had this very rich and dynamic thing, but one person doing it would be no more possible now than it was then. So I think we would do well to actually consider this role of, in other words, not making one person do everything. And in terms of the way we think about actually doing the enhancement of what may be a shared picture. So there's a shared visualization in the space, but the actual, and there's a difference, and drawing a difference between live manipulation. So if one person is control, we don't want everyone coming in just moving stuff around because mayhem follows. But people might be able to either, dependent on essentially how the session is enabled, either actually directly change information, which might actually change, say, the look of something or its size or whatever, or simply to provide additional information. Now, for instance, they might be putting in simplistic terms, they might be tagging something so as to allow and enhance implicit relationships. So you're not trying to directly manipulate something, but you are enriching the information within the space that allows the group to draw from it. So I think that concept of an additional role who's not the primary actor is actually very valuable. Thanks.
Fabian.
I think I forgot what I wanted to say, so I'll just say what I said in the chat, that we do have quite a bit in terms of networking already done, and the most basic one, which I think is probably overlooked, is web dev, namely how we make the state permanent. Like basically when you close the page and you come back and it's still there, is saving to web dev. It's just, you imagine a file server, that's it. And it sounds like okay, but it's not really collaboration. But I think in our case, where we don't necessarily need to see the person blinking, basically, if you don't like have super low latency, but it's just exchanging files around, it can go a really long way. We might want more, but I think again in the context of reading and authoring academic document, collaborating either in the same room or through the entire web. But it's not a video game, for example, whereas if it's a competitive video game, you need like sub-millisecond latency maybe, but not here. So again, it's to some of the suggestions, for example, from Ren also on Croquet. So there are a lot of networking beautiful solution, I want to say, but most likely we're not going to want sub-millisecond latency, and also not like a billion users. It's going to be like 2, maybe 3, maybe 5 somehow.
Okay.
But initially, I don't think it needs to be like at super large scale. So I think that's also it's another cheat, let's say. It's another way that let us explore faster, that it's not necessarily super reliable. I also see PeerJS and YJS. So to give a bit of context also for people who are not into networking, PeerJS, you basically do peer-to-peer. You say, hey, I have another computer over there, we can chat. And it's nice because it means the data is not going through the server, let's say Facebook server, for example, which you might not want. And YJS is more about merging documents. It's not necessarily, it's when you use Google Docs, for example, and when you type a key and someone else see the new key, and then it's highlighting different colors, which I think, again, for collaboration and text, how we can merge different pieces without restarting a document from scratch. Obviously, it sounds, yes, that's what we want, but that's still relatively new. Like merging documents live with different people at once is a new thing, but I think it's quite interesting. But yeah, there are quite a few solutions. What I think is crucial to keep in mind is that it's going to be few people at once with relatively high latency, which gives a lot of leeway. And finally, I have two things. Mozilla Hubs, unfortunately, is gone from Mozilla. They fired everyone, basically, which I think is a shame, but that's how it is. And I contributed to it and the documentation, so I'm quite aware of how to set it up and use it. I used it because, actually, ironically enough, not for the social aspect, but how well manipulation of document was with Mozilla Hubs. Namely, you could drag and drop a PDF, and then your friend or colleague across the world, in headset or not, could see the PDF and could like go to the next page, and basically you could also make a live presentation. It's been used in IEEE VR, I think 2023 or a few years ago. So it was actually used in research for researchers for live collaboration without necessarily needing the headset. So we know for sure that it's usable, let's say. But the downside of Mozilla Hubs, or now the Hubs Foundation and the whole stack, is gigantic. It's really complex and some really, how can I say, unique technical decisions that you need a programming language that nobody else is using, basically, which is fun when you start your own project, but then for anybody else who's not familiar with it, it's kind of tricky. And the last point, besides, so it just, I want to highlight the different technical choices possible for networking, because there are quite a few. But I think one thing that I think is especially interesting in our specific situation is the collaboration on documents. Again, we have WebDAV, we can put document on it. As Frode mentioned, we have filters. There are quite a few documents we can play with. And I don't want to say nobody else does it, but I think it's rare. Like the most complex we've seen was, for example, Mozilla Hubs and uploading a PDF. Nothing deeper than editing the content of a PDF, for example, or a document, markdown, whatever. That's not been done. Maybe for good reason, maybe not. But I think the point is the intersection of asymmetric collaboration in VR and outside of VR with the content of a document, because we have the filters, I think is quite unique, and I think there is something to dig in there potentially. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabien. And I see Paul is here, which is great. Sorry about the time change, Paul. Yes, I completely didn't realize it was going to be this weekend. So I think we'll spend a few more minutes just rounding off what we've been talking on now, because we're on a little bit on a roll. And then we'll go straight onto your presentation. Is that cool? Okay, excellent. So guys, briefly, I want you to tell me things to write down. It'll take less than 10 minutes, hopefully 5 minutes. And it's based on this. So as you all know, I think, you can define things in Author, which is one of our test applications. We've added this tiny little button here that says spatial. Click on that, and all it gives us is the XY coordinates and an ID for whatever this thing is. Logically, we only need to add a Z dimension plus other stuff, right? We need to have the orientation. And do we need to have that in all the axes? I'm asking, because I'm writing a wish list now, so we can take that away after the call. So just tell me, since I can't see notes, what should we have on this list? Team says we need, right. So this is almost like what we're talking about. I'm the typist. Tell me what you want in the environment. I'm going to do some obvious. Please just speak out and tell me more. Around how many axes? 3 axes is enough? We want a label, right? Which in many cases might be it's all there is.
Sorry, but do you mean in 3D or in 2D? Because the title says 2D.
No, it doesn't.
Hmm.
A thought.
Yes.
I mean, how many axes you annotate really depends on what you're showing, what you want to show. So, for instance, you might have a six-sided object. You decided your primitive for your object is a cube. You maybe wanted to show something different on each face, and so you might need to know which faces, which pair of faces are on which axis and which axis. But you don't need to know that for everything. So what you want is something that effectively grows that option. You put in other words, there's a default or a null is assumed for anything that's not stated. One thing I think you need to differentiate is between the environment, which is the top object, which might store things like, well, what image do you want to put in the background, or what set of 3D objects do you want in terms of tables and chairs, windows, mountains, whatever. Because objects probably won't do that, or objects might want to store that, well, if you're going to show me, I want to be seen in a room that looks like, and then would link to, this is where I think JSON LD would help you a lot, because you don't want to record everything everywhere all the time. So for instance, the identity of that room and all the objects and tables and chairs in it might be a link to another data object that you don't have to load directly, but it can be a close call.
Mark, this takes into account what you said earlier. The environment has nothing to do with this. That's separate. So what we're thinking about is a virtual cube, invisible cube, because 3D will always be on a computer in a cube, so to speak, right? So within the cube, and the orientation, you make a very good point, but probably if you have three axes, you can twist it at any angle if you use all three numbers, right?
Well, if you've got, say, a cube with 6 faces, you might want to know which face. You might say, the faces 2 and 4, which are opposite one another along the x-axis, but you might want to know whether 2 points to x positive or 4 points to x positive. I mean, you can go down a lot of rabbit hole here. What you want is something that just allows you to put in the extra information you need. If say the object was being shown as a sphere, then you don't need to record what points to what direction, because it's moot. They're all the same in all things. So in other words, the need to specify information about what points in what direction would fall out, say, from the nature of the shape primitive you're using to visualize that object within the space.
Yeah. Right. Let's try to stay away from rabbit holes, and we are going to move across. I'm being very pressuring everyone to see if there are a common small group. Most of these things will be text or primitives with this kind of.
Can I ask a question for clarification? Are we talking about an individual environment here, or this networked environment that we were speaking about earlier?
We're talking about the networked environment.
Okay, so if you're talking about the network environment, you do also need to recognize power dynamics in the space. And this gets into a whole other kind, you can compare it to a physical environment, for instance. There's a difference between whether I'm standing in front of a classroom talking at my students as opposed to sitting around a table with them and having a flatter discussion. I prefer the latter, and because it promotes better two-way discussion. If this is like doing a PowerPoint presentation where you're basically the lead person, whoever that is showing everything to everybody else. Oh, look at my room and look at this. That's a different dynamic than everybody sort of sitting around having a conversation around things. And you have to structure the space in such a way that it levels that. And that's a complicated thing. It's hard to pull off in an environment, virtual environment. It's hard to pull off in a physical environment, but it's definitely something you have to be mindful of.
Yes, it's definitely something to be mindful of, and that is for a different discussion, a very important discussion. All I'm really talking about now, because we've been kind of going around in circles for many, many months, is just there is a set of things. They're in an invisible virtual cube that can be, the whole thing can be scaled. What are the things we need? This is so we can start building something. Okay, so
I've built a lot of collaborative environments, both online and in person. Physical, and it's amazing how some really subtle differences can really upend the conversations, and some things work and some things don't. And yeah, it's hard to see those sometimes ahead of time.
Yeah.
I'll shut up.
No, Tom, you're highlighting really important things. So now at least what we've done, because we're going to switch over in literally 1 minute.
Well, just quickly, when you say layers, is this?
I don't know.
I think this is going back to your idea that things sit in a particular box in the space. I'm just wondering whether it's better that the box defines what objects that go in it, rather than all the objects trying to define which of many boxes they're in. One of the things is you want to avoid duplication, because the more duplication there is, the more likely you're going to get out of sync with the data.
Yeah.
So the cleaner way would be that if you're defining, say, a frame that has only the articles from Future of Text 5, if we were talking about the book, then the Future of Text 5 frame would know the knowledge objects that live within it. The knowledge objects themselves could query if they're inside a frame, because there could be multiple frames. There could be another frame on another axis that also includes them.
It's simpler than that. What I mean by cube is, so let's say we start by going from this map onto this environment, right? It loads as a flat cube. Once you start stretching something out, but if you have something that is it is a document, it is a thing. This is not taking into account multiple things being given in. It all goes into one thing. All of these questions are really, really important, Mark, and we need to have written and discussed. Yeah, a cube can be flattened depending on how thick it needs to be. Sometimes, when you take the map from author, for instance, it is flat.
Well, it's a square then.
But you can
flat cube is a square.
You can, Mark, you can instantly take something and move it out. Now it's no longer flat. So in maths, for computer graphics, it is inside a cube, right? We don't see the cube, right? So there isn't a visual boundary box, because if it's way over here, the coordinates has to relate to that. But anyway, this is a good list of things. We need to move it now across to Paul. But please note two things. This can get quickly very complicated. And please also note how it is important to try to have something. We cannot make perfect the enemy of let's have something to test. So let's continue this discussion next week. And we have 45 minutes left. So unless anyone has any comments or questions on this, we can switch over to a more interesting philosophical space. So I'd like to introduce Paul, who is a bona fide philosopher. A modern philosopher is also a scientist, which was new to me way back when we met. Met Paul when I was at Southampton along with Mark. And he today will be talking about, well, actually, Paul, why don't you introduce your topic yourself, and I will shush for a little bit.
Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, good. I've been having quite a lot of problems with my internet connection over the weekend, so I'm hoping the connection stays up for the duration of this talk. If it cuts out suddenly, that means it's gone down, and I'll connect via a cellular network. But hopefully everything will be fine. So let me try and share my screen. Okay. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to talk. I'm sorry that I don't attend these sessions. It's not due to a lack of interest. It's just due to a lack of time. I tend to, as Fro intimated, I tend to work across quite a lot of areas. So I do quite a lot of work in philosophy, but I also work in computer science, building stuff as well. So that tends to consume quite a lot of my time and energy. But anyway, so today I'd like to talk a little bit about large language models and personal memory. So this is a topic that I've been working on for a little while. I have a paper that I'm currently putting together on this topic, and the core aim is to explore how large language models can, or at least could, support personal memory. So an individual's memory of the past, as well as perhaps aspects of self-knowledge. And I'm also interested in the narrational capabilities of large language models. So within social psychology, there is a lot of interest in the way in which our individual identity and our sense of self is constituted by the narratives we have about the past, the sort of lives that we've led, the things that have happened to us, the way that we dealt with those. And if you look at individuals' life stories, you can identify certain narrative arcs that recur quite frequently, and some of those are reflected in the fictional works that we have in both literature and cinema. So things like the hero's journey, the Cinderella story, the tragedy. And so what I'm looking at here is the ways in which large language models, in conjunction with individuals, the ways in which these systems could perhaps help to function as memory systems, supporting memory, with perhaps also implications for notions of self and identity. It used to be the case. I mean, memory technologies have been around for a long time. Most of the research that's looked at this has fallen under the heading of life logging. So, of course, we have all of these devices now that gather data about various aspects of our lives and our experience. Some of these have been used in clinical applications. So the image on this slide shows the Microsoft SenseCam. I don't believe this is being manufactured now, but it used to be used with dementia patients to record scenes from an egocentric perspective, and then the patient would be engaged in conversation about the images that had been taken during the course of the day. And the research showed that this had beneficial effects for individuals' memory of daily events. And I think the introduction of large language models doesn't really displace any of these innovations. I think those innovations are going to persist. But I think the advent of large language model does add an additional dimension to the way that we think about this data being collected and processed and used. And really what this amounts to, I think, is the collaborative attempt to acquire and restructure large bodies of text for the specific purpose of supporting individual memory and for narrating an individual's life story. I doubt large language models will need much of an introduction. So when I say large language model, I'm thinking of systems like ChatGPT and Gemini. The core capability of these systems, of course, is their capacity for natural language generation and processing. In addition to that, they also they're very good at working with code. So actually most of the work that I do with large language models is with regard to their coding abilities more than their natural language capabilities. Both of these are important, and I regard both programming languages and natural languages as lingua form structures. So when I talk about language, I'm thinking of both of those language types. And when it comes to personal memory applications, there's really three innovations that have proved to be important. So the first is multimodal capabilities. Sometimes these multimodal capabilities are built into a single foundational model. Sometimes they're implemented as more specialized models. But these multimodal capabilities are important when it comes to processing images and audio and other types of sensors, like data from physiological, biological sensors, for example. A second innovation is the growing use of what's called external or non-parametric memory. So a typical large language model generates text by exploiting what's called parametric memory, which is the memory encoded in the system's weights, the weights of a neural network. External memory refers to a body of data that lies external to the large language model. And the large language model can exploit this resource by sending queries to the external data store, retrieving data as text, and then assimilating that text into the context window. And that provides an opportunity for tailored responses, personalized responses, without having to retrain the large language model itself. So it's a very efficient way of tailoring the outputs of large language models. And then a final innovation relates to tool use. So the way in which large language models can exploit all manner of online computational tools, such as mathematical tools, search engines, code interpreters, or indeed other large language models. So all of these capabilities, I think, can be put to good use in terms of using large language models as a personal memory system. And I'll attempt to elaborate on that in a couple of slides. In terms of the current state of the art, there's already, there's so much work on large language models, it's not funny anymore. There have been some existing attempts to build personal memory systems using large language models, so Memoro and Memory Bank, two examples. A particularly interesting one is called OS1. So this is it's a large language model that's combined with smart glasses. And the specific aim is to implement a companion that has access to a shared history of events. So the idea is you wear these glasses, they're connected to a large language model. And as you go about your daily life, the large language model is there as a kind of constant companion that shares in your own lived experience. And eventually this enables you to have conversations with the agent pretty much as you would a social companion. And OS1 is actually implemented, it's inspired by the artificial protagonist of the movie Her. You may or may not have seen that, but the movie essentially depicts Joaquin Phoenix as the human protagonist who buys this AI companion called Samantha, and she becomes an indispensable part of his life, and he develops this kind of emotional bond with her. And many of the capabilities of OS1 mimic that kind of cinematic character. It's not quite as sophisticated, of course, but the capabilities are at least analogous. But you don't need to, those existing large language models are research prototypes, but actually some form of personal memory is actually built into ChatGPT. So I've been working with my ChatGPT agent for over a year, and that agent now has access to a large body of information about me because it has access to a personal memory store. And I can add information to that store by simply asserting facts. So if I say my line manager at the University of Southampton is Michael Boniface, then this sentence that's highlighted in red gets added to the ChatGPT's personal memory. And then if I ask a question, at a later time, who is my line manager, the ChatGPT agent now knows the answer. So, this kind of personal memory, it's not personal memory application. It's not a purely hypothetical or speculative capability. It's increasingly a description of the way in which large language models, or at least production large language models, are being used. When it comes to thinking about personal memory applications, there are basically two approaches or two strategies. The first is fine-tuning, where you collect personal data and then train a large language model on that data. For a variety of reasons, that isn't really an option. Computational cost is one notable issue. So in lieu of that, researchers have begun to explore what are called augmented generation techniques, and these come in a variety of forms. So I'm not going to have time to go through all of these, but suffice to say, contemporary large language models can, courtesy of the fact that they have this kind of core facility with language, they're able to interact with a surrounding nexus of online tools and services that exploit either a natural language interface or that can be interacted with via code. So things like search augmented generation, that refers to interaction with search engines. Retrieval augmented generation refers to interactions with vector databases, mostly, that contain a mix of text and latent encodings of text in the form of embeddings. Knowledge augmented generation refers to interactions with graph databases that may contain semantic information like ontologies. Tool augmented generation refers to interactions with any kind of online computational service that exposes an API. Human augmented generation is sort of a newcomer. This refers to interactions with the human agent. So if the large language model is unclear about something, or if the large language model needs clarification, or if there is some body of missing information, then the large language model can prompt the human user. And clearly, the fact that large language models have this facility with our own human language makes them ideally placed to participate in that sort of active solicitation of information. And then finally, we've got code augmented generation. So as I said earlier, large language models are very good at generating code. And so by generating code, they can effectively create these kind of ad hoc computational tools to solve problems that the bare large language model wouldn't be able to solve. So mathematical or counting tasks are one example of that. The large language model itself is not particularly reliable when it comes to mathematical tasks. But if the mathematical task can be represented in code, then the large language model can generate the code, invoke a code interpreter, and then it has the answer. So all of those augmented generation techniques, they are a feature of existing personal memory systems. And the way that I tend to think about these systems working is in terms of 4 stages of processing. So the first stage is what I call encoding. So the goal here is to actually acquire information, and that information may be passively acquired courtesy of wearable devices, smart glasses, ongoing conversational interactions, and other sorts of devices. As I mentioned in the previous slide, I think this notion of human augmented generation is particularly interesting. It's this idea that the large language model can actually play an active role in encoding, shaping the nature or the structure of the encoding process. And one example of that is when it comes to eliciting information about subjective affective states. So rather than try to do that via the the use of wearable devices that are measuring galvanic skin responses or whatever. Large language models provide an opportunity to do something a bit different, which is just ask the person, how are you feeling at the present time? Or your heart's racing, but you're sitting down. Does that mean you're giving a presentation? These kinds of ways of disambiguating between possibly between bodies of data that might otherwise lead to confusion. And so what's interesting here, I think, is the way in which the advent of these large language models and the conversational capabilities that they have enables us to think of pretty much all of the memory stages and memory processes that I'm going to discuss as being something of a collaborative activity or a mixed initiative type activity. So another process that I think is relevant here is elaboration. And the way that I see this working is once raw data records have been collected, the large language model would process those records, perhaps in the background, with a view to elaborating, refining, enriching them. And again, this is a feature of some of the existing personal memory systems that are out there. So it may not be possible to process images, for example, in real time. So you want an additional step where that process happens offline. But in addition to rendering multimodal data into a more narrative or textual form, there are other types of processes that are relevant here. So things like semantic tagging or the event segmentation, the creation of textual summaries of the day's events or the week's events or the year's events. These kinds of processes are important because they not only help to improve the accessibility of recorded data for future recall, they're also enriching the mnemonic record in a way that can be used to support future interactions between the human and the large language model. Retrieval. So once we've collected data and it's been enriched, refined, whatever, large language models can be used to support the recall of information. That could be via an explicit request. So you might say, what was the title of that presentation that I gave to the Future of Text community last week? Or it might be based on contextual cues. So you might be in a particular context and based on the available sensory data, the large language model retrieves records from the back-end memory database and uses that as a basis for establishing a conversation. Again, there are opportunities here for collaborative recall. So if we think about the way in which memory sometimes works in a collaborative or social context, particularly in situations where you're with a long-term partner, sometimes you partially remember something. So you might say, "Oh, what was the name of that show that we went to 6 months ago?" And then your partner says, "Oh, I think it had a certain actor in it." And then you say, "Oh yeah, it had a certain," and I think we were at this place. And what you see in that situation is this kind of progressive, conversationally mediated process of what's called cue elaboration. So courtesy of the conversational exchanges that you have, you're progressively elaborating an initial cue to a point where either yourself or your partner is able to actually retrieve the memory, and then the retrieval problem is solved. And there has actually been some interesting work looking at how you can interact with large language models in this sort of manner, where you're providing cues to the large language model is providing cues to you, and you're sort of prompting one another in order to retrieve relevant information. And then the final step is what I've called joint reminiscing. So here, again, you have conversational interactions with a large language model, but the focus isn't necessarily one of retrieval per se. It could be more about talking about the past, as is often the case in social contexts. When we're with a friend or a lover, a lot of our conversations are oriented towards the past, things that we've done together. And to the extent that large language models count as something akin to a quasi-social companion, you can imagine them participating in the very same processes that we see in human dyads when it comes to the selective recall of the past and how certain memories get reinforced and others wither away simply because they're not a topic for conversation. And in addition, I think that there are some important opportunities here when it comes to clinical applications. So I talked about the SenseCam device earlier, and you can imagine that sort of capability being applied here, where the large language model is engaging in conversation with an individual about photographs of the past, or they're assisting a dementia patient with the creation of a coherent narrative or a life story. So this sort of work has been done in the past, but it's been done with human caregivers. But I think the sort of capability that I'm envisaging here, coupled with the conversational capabilities of large language models, opens the door to these sorts of processes being done in a more or less continual fashion, and there may be therapeutic implications associated with that. The other aspect, aside from purely memory, is this notion of life stories and narrative identity. So this is increasingly a prominent topic in cognitive science and in social psychology as well. It concerns the way in which we understand ourselves and our future relative to the past that we've had and the stories that we create about the past. And those stories are obviously driven by memory, but they're not the same as memory. So certain details may get omitted. Some events are given a certain salience, and they feature quite prominently in the life story. And sometimes the story gets tweaked in certain ways, either for one's psychological benefit or not. But the basic idea here is that I think this kind of memory-related role for large language model plays quite nicely into this body of research that is focused on the psychological and affective significance of narratives and the way in which they help us to make sense of both our past, but also the way in which they constrain our future. Before finishing, I want to say something about hallucinations. So whenever I talk about this topic, the first thing that folks always say is, well, large language models are not very reliable. They have these hallucinations, and this means that they're not particularly well suited to serve as a memory technology. And one thing that we could say in regard to that is that the augmented generation techniques that I've discussed, they are used to mitigate hallucinations and improve the reliability or the veracity of large language model outputs, but errors still persist, and I suspect they always will. I think, just thinking about the nature of large language models, I think some degree of error is probably unavoidable. The question is whether
Oh,
that's a
just
good
really
or
briefly, because of the time difference changing and all of that nonsense, we have 20 minutes left.
yeah,
So
I've nearly finished.
yeah, no, that's good. So if you wrap up within 5 minutes, then we have 15
Yeah,
minutes.
that's fine. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you.
So one thing I want to suggest here, probably controversially, is I don't want to explore technological ways of eliminating errors. I want to suggest a reframing of hallucinations. I want to cast them in perhaps a more positive role. So within the AI community, there's a growing consensus that hallucinations, the term hallucination is not the right word to characterize the sorts of errors that large language models make. A better term is confabulation. So the idea is that these errors are better understood as attempts to preserve a degree of narrative coherence, even though at the expense of accuracy. And I think that reframing is interesting because in human memory research, confabulation is not necessarily understood as a flaw or a vice. It's understood as more of a feature of individual memory, personal memory. It's understood as something that can play a psychologically positive role in helping us to form a coherent life story. And in general, when one looks at the narratives that people create about the past, individuals that have coherent narratives tend to score better when it comes to psychological well-being, whereas individuals who score less well tend to have rather chaotic narratives that score much less well on coherence. And it may be that it's actually the latter group that have the more accurate memories, but the point is that accuracy is not necessarily a good thing. And so what I want to suggest is that our understanding of what constitutes a good memory is not necessarily the same as having a perfectly accurate memory. And insofar as we accept that, then it's not clear to me that the propensity of large language models to generate or hallucinations or confabulations is necessarily a bad thing. It may just be that in a personal memory context, that these features of large language models are just the thing that we need, and it would be a mistake to try and engineer them out. Rather than treat them as a flaw, we should instead try to leverage them to deliver these psychologically beneficial applications. That's obviously a research topic for the future, but I just wanted to suggest that as a potential discussion topic. So in conclusion, I've talked briefly about the way in which large language models could work in a personal memory context, the way in which they could help us develop new kinds of memory technology that transform the vision of life logging technologies as merely preserving the past to this more kind of generative and co-constructive vision of memory. And in addition to that, I think large language models can play an important role in the co-creation of these personalized narratives with implications for topics like self, the way that we understand ourselves and our past, and undoubtedly as well, they have implications for the notion of narrative identity, which is now a very prominent topic in philosophy and psychology. And then finally, in thinking about these memory technologies, I'm particularly thinking about the way in which these kinds of systems might be applied in clinical contexts. And of course, the dementia context is probably the most salient. Individuals with memory disorders we might want to think about how these systems could benefit those individuals when it comes to preserving, not just remedying mnemonic problems, but also preserving some degree of identity and self-coherence. In addition to that, I think there are potential applications when it comes to psychoaffective disorders, so persistent depression or dysthymia. One of the features of that disorder seems to be that individuals are, I don't want to say stuck in the past, but they're kind of constrained by the past. They have a kind of personal history that could have been better, and they can't seem to move beyond that. And so I think it's worth thinking about the way in which these technologies could help to potentially reframe the past or create a new kind of narrative or a different kind of view of an existing narrative. Yeah, and so that's it. I'll finish there.
Thank you, Paul. I'd like you to actually go on a little bit further. I have a very specific question because this was phenomenal and from a very interesting perspective. But in order to understand it better, I'm wondering if, and if you feel it's not relevant, please do tell me. We're close enough friends that you can tell me to shush. The virtual Dave Clark thing is
Sorry, say that again.
the virtual philosopher, the virtual Dave Clark project you've been working on.
Oh, Digital Andy Clark.
Andy Clark. Yeah, I don't know why I
Yeah.
got that wrong. Thank you for the correction. Andy Clark. Yes, Fabian as well. Yes. Anyway, that's something. That's kind of from the outside, where you have, if I understood you correctly, it's not to make a virtual Andy Clark whereby someone who doesn't know him can ask questions and it'll be basically taken from a book he's written. As far as you presented it many years ago, it was a matter of he himself could ask it questions about things he hadn't thought of. So, in light of what you're talking about today, which seems to be using this technology for a self, would you mind spending a minute on how this approach might also help you interact with another? And then, Brandel, please, we'll open it up for questions.
Yeah. So the Digital Andy system, for folks who are not aware, is it was intended as a digital replica of the philosopher Andy Clark. And the way the system was developed, I basically took everything that Andy Clark had ever written and incorporated it into an external memory store and connected it to large language models. And then it works using this technique called retrieval augmented generation, along with prompting. So there's quite a lot of prompting behind the scenes as well to get the large language model to adopt the persona of Andy Clark. The reason that that particular model is able to answer questions that the real world Andy Clark may not know the answer to is because it has the freedom to combine what it already knows, courtesy of internal parametric memory, with external non-parametric memory. So if you ask a question, for example, so Andy Clark's one of his main focus academic areas of interest is called the extended mind. If you ask Digital Andy what is the relationship between large language models and the extended mind, the real world Andy Clark would not necessarily know the answer to that because he's not particularly conversant with large language models. But the Digital Andy system does, and it merges its internal knowledge with the external knowledge, and it comes up with an interesting response, which was actually the basis of a paper that myself and Andy Clark wrote earlier in the year. Now, when it comes to personal memory, you really want the responses of the large language model to be oriented towards the retrieved information, the personal data, as opposed to internal information. That's usually accomplished by prompting, but some degree of merger between the two is pretty much unavoidable, I think, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, you want the large language model to have some degree of, if you like, common sense when it comes to the interpretation of information that's been retrieved from an external repository. But for the most part, it's an issue of prompting the model to attend to a specific body of data. There was another, so actually, in addition to the Digital Andy model, there is another model, Keith Frankish GPT. So Keith Frankish is another philosopher who specializes in consciousness. And in that situation, Keith didn't want the large language model to be reporting extraneous information. He wanted it to be limited. He wanted the responses to be restricted to whatever he'd written about. And so in that case, the implementation strategy was somewhat different. And I used a mix of explicit prompting as well as a separate model that does some verification of the large language model response. So the goal there was to limit the large language model's output specifically to the works of Keith Frankish and nothing else. The problem, of course, is that you can't ask Keith Frankish, if you ask Keith Frankish, what the Keith Frankish GPT, what do you think about large language models and consciousness? The model will say, I don't know, because Keith Frankish hasn't written about that.
Thank you, Paul, for that additional perspective. And Brandel and Carl.
Thank you, Paul. This has been a really thrilling introduction to the sort of function and possibility with these things. I'm curious, so are you sort of actively investigating these things, or are these sort of postulations of where this kind of technology can go?
It's mostly, I mean, it's mostly an exercise in philosophy, I would say, at the moment. I mean, I do obviously work with large language models and implement systems, not ones that are specifically tailored to personal memory per se. The work I reported today, as I said, I think is part of some philosophical work I'm doing for a journal paper on the memory of tomorrow, future of memory, and the role of text specifically in those kinds of systems. So I mean, it's potentially the basis for future work. I think there's a lot of work to be done in this area, and not all of it need be of a philosophical nature. So I think, you know, there are important opportunities when it comes to thinking about the therapeutic implications of these kinds of technologies. But it's not something that I have a research grant to work on at the moment.
Reasonable. Yeah, I only ask because they're the kinds of things that can be investigated by doing Wizard of Oz with LLMs and simply not using LLMs for it to say, like, here's the high watermark with a person of what this kind of thing does, and that would be independently useful. So if ever the time comes, I would strongly suggest doing it first without actual AI, just make artificial intelligence, and then to do the other. But if it's still in the realm of the philosophical, then I think either one works. Thank you.
Thanks, Brandel. Carl.
So I had three sort of questions, but they're all multifaceted. So I'll put them in the chat so that they can be referred back to later. But I'll go ahead and read them off. So first one is, how does this approach handle the problem of AI psychosis, which is cases in which AI models have amplified, validated, or even co-created psychotic symptoms within individuals? Secondly, if this is planned to be implemented over a longitudinal time frame rather than just sort of disjoint analysis of like a small handful of recordings, how do you avoid the exploration K value from injecting randomness into the record, which will compound over time? This is important because this is not a confabulation, because it is not used to fill gaps. It is created probabilistically and without intent. And thirdly, having users to sort of disambiguate data about their emotional state is entirely dependent on how accurate they are at assessing their own state And psychiatry research shows us that people are just god awful at this. So how do we account for user-induced inaccuracies?
Um, so, so first at a general level, I mean, the aim of this system is not necessarily to perfectly represent the past, and it's certainly not to represent the past in a way that is discordant with the individual's own experience. And if one looks at individual biomemory, that's not perfect either. Human memory is highly fallible. And it's not even clear that truth is normative for memory. So we might think of that. We might think that memory should aim to be a veridical representation of the past, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it evolved for that specific purpose. So at a general level, I'm not kind of disputing or undermining any of the issues that you've just raised. I think that those are all worthy topics for future research. But I do, I am a little bit skeptical, I think, of the idea that the sorts of errors that that large language models might make are necessarily negative all the time. I don't, and I think, you know, when it comes to thinking about the interactions between large language models and human individuals, it's possible that the large language model may accurately record the past, and then the human edits the memory record in a different way, so they sort of misremember the past, and thus the hallucination gets built into the large language model. You know, what do you do in that situation? Is the large language model right, or the human right? I would say that it's more important to align the large language model's memory with the human's memory. So alignment is perhaps more important than accuracy. The second issue you mentioned, I'm not sure I understood that. It sounded very technical, but you know, I think, you know, all of the issues that you've mentioned, I think are all worthy of being explored in future research. You know, I'm not suggesting that the systems that we've got at the moment are ready for deployment, or you know, all I can really refer to is the research prototypes that have been developed. My own experience with ChatGPT. The issue of psychosis that you mentioned, I mean, that's an interesting topic. And it's certainly, you know, I don't know a huge amount about this, but my understanding is that this kind of psychosis emerges as a consequence of prolonged or protracted exchanges between the human and the large language model, and it kind of sets up self-reinforcing cycles. I could certainly imagine that happening here. Yeah. Especially, I think, if the large language model was being prompted in a certain way to support the human or confirm their beliefs about something. If it was being prompted in that sort of cooperative way, that might be an issue.
Thanks, Paul. Mark?
Paul, interesting as ever. I just want one thought listening to this and thinking about its use in a sort of therapeutic sense is, can large language models forget, or can they put guardrails around sensitive things? Because for a lot of people, the thing they hold closest to themselves often is trauma. It's a broad term, because one person's trauma may be a thing of no consequence at all to another person. So it's hard to give it what it is. But the point is that so if I'm life logging, and my life logging would therefore libel, say, something very traumatic, whatever it is, happened, can I edit that? Well, not necessarily. I could one indeed edit it out at all, or should one want to, or would you put guardrails around it? I don't have an answer, and I'm not really asking you to have a short one for it, but it seems an interesting challenge in terms of therapeutic things. And I suppose it broadens more widely to uses of LLMs to be able to say, right, I know there's some rubbish in there that you really shouldn't be using, just go forget it. But I don't think it can forget. Thanks.
Well, I mean, if you build these systems using the augmented generation techniques, then the individual's personal data is stored separate from the model. So it might be stored in a conventional database, for example. So it's editable. It can be edited or deleted. So the individual could delete aspects of the memory record. I mean, I do all that all the time with my own ChatGPT agent, because I don't necessarily want the ChatGPT agent to remember all of the things that we've talked about. So that's possible. Whether it's positive or not is less clear, because if the record is editable, can be edited, then it could be contaminated as well. There is a security issue there, right? If it's so easy to tweak your own memory of the past, then somebody else might tweak it as well. So it introduces a security issue. It's the downside of having very accessible memories.
Probably one of the most sci-fi
Thanks.
discussions we've had. Fabienne, over to you.
Thank you. So it's a very, so I'm a developer. So when I hear a talk, usually my initial reaction is like, okay, how can I implement this? How can I try it and do the same myself and re-implement? Which in this case, one of the things that maybe you expressed, but I didn't get, is basically how to select the model. You mentioned, let's say, OpenAI, I think, a few times, or ChatGPT rather, from OpenAI. And I think, like, is the assumption that they're interexchangeable or not? And if not, how to select them? Because to give a very pragmatic example, DeepSeek, which is a Chinese model, has been very popular at the beginning of the year because it was so much more efficient and thus so much cheaper in terms of energy costs and all this. But also, if you search for the June 4th incident or Tiananmen Square, you don't get anything back. Which, like, for your own mental model or ethics, or that probably has consequences. And thus, if the models are not interchangeable, and some of them are black boxes, basically, they're not open source, they are they are impossible to study, because, for example, ChatGPT 4 suddenly became ChatGPT 5, and even researchers couldn't access it anymore. Yeah. So how does one navigate through those different models, regardless of what they even believe? Like, how can they rely on such black box to explore themselves and their memories?
One of the virtues of the augmented generation techniques is that you can easily swap in and out different models, because the model is separate from the surrounding penumbra of data, the personal bodies of data, the images, the whatever. Those things exist as their own sort of repository, and the goal is to retrieve relevant information from those stores and use that to tailor the output of the core foundation model, but the model itself is not changing. So with the Digital Andy system, the transition from GPT-4 to GPT-5 wasn't particularly painful, because I just added GPT-5 as an extra model, and the system works as usual. I've tried it with DeepSeek as well. I mean, the way the system is implemented, it's really up to the user to select which model they want to use and which one they find beneficial for their own purposes. So that doesn't really answer your question, because I think you were asking what model is the best. I think that's obviously an empirical issue, and it may be that there's no single model. it may be that when it comes to thinking about memory processes, we actually want to think more of an ecology of different foundation models that are used for specific purposes. So narrative generation, the generation of narrative artifacts could be one task. Semantic tagging could be another. So it's not necessarily about a single model per se. I guess I was thinking more about a series of workflows that would incorporate different models. But I think the use of augmented generation techniques does give us a degree of agnosticism when it comes to the selection of particular models. But it may be that with further research, it turns out that there are certain models that are ideal for particular purposes. I think that's an empirical issue, certainly one that's worth exploring.
So many things coming up here, which is quite wonderful. And one of them is the question of what should we forget? And the accuracy, so to speak, of memory, which is really, really important stuff. I think it was Tom who said how much of civilization is based on us forgetting. Forgetting is a really important thing. And also, of course, we cannot have a memory stored in a vial, so to speak, and then plugged in later, because what it is plugged into, will have changed. Right? So even if it was technically possible to have an accurate memory store, it won't be when it reconnects with the brain. And so that's fine. So then we can start with the idea of playing with what it means to have these new types of memories. When I'm a photographer, I have more than a meter's worth of books, mostly of my son, that I take pictures of. But when we got married, my wife and I had no video because I intentionally wanted a vague memory, a party memory. I didn't want that to be with garish, normal colors and the color of the sky that day. So I think, Paul, what you're really looking at here, because you're looking at it from so many angles, is what it means to have memory. And we could imagine at the birth of photography itself, people may have similar arguments saying, oh my God, if you just take pictures of everything, that'll be awful. You won't forget it and it'll look too realistic. And then someone else might say, well, what if you take a picture from the wrong angle and tell the wrong story? There are interesting similarities here. So clearly this is on a whole new level. But as long as we let go of some of our fears, and some of our fears are absolutely well-founded, especially Fabienne's comments on who makes the LLMs. And of course, there are many discussions around that. But the notion of choosing how to access your memories, for instance, a while ago in our project, I felt despondent, as we all do in projects. It was one of those days, so I had a meeting with Fabienne, and it was, Then in the middle of that meeting, there was So that was, currently we don't do much AI of our transcript, but I did that one. I was really shocked that the transcript included, there was despondency at the beginning of the meeting, but at this specific point, it changed into excitement. Right? It's both interesting and useful in that if I choose to have a memory of this year, I would probably choose what kind of memories are useful. What ideas did they came up and by whom and how did they change? How did our mood change based on what we were doing? So I think what's so exciting, Paul, along many other things you're talking about, is we can choose which strands of memories to extract. With a photograph, you have to have the whole scene, unless you're Stalin and you get rid of someone, so to speak, right? But with this, you can choose to have memories only of a friend or a loved one who's no longer with us or a philosopher you don't have access to. It doesn't have to be everything. So very thoughtful stuff, Paul. I just wanted to comment that and thank you and wonder if you have anything in reply.
Yeah, just to say that I think the way in which our own autobiographical memories get shaped is in conversations with others. So there is a social aspect to that process, the way in which certain when we're with certain people, we talk about certain things. When we talk about certain things, we're forced to recollect on those experiences, and that gives those memories a degree of strength that they might not otherwise have. If you're by yourself, you have no friends, you're isolated, as sometimes happens in old age. You have no one to talk to about those things, and you begin to lose contact with your past. I think one of the things that's interesting about large language models and their conversational capabilities is they provide an opportunity to engage in that kind of conversationally mediated vivification of the past, which could have, I think, mnemonic influences. Whether they're positive or negative, I think, is something that's still to be determined. But it does represent, I think, a new era in memory-related research.
Yes, and an interesting addition to that is my memory in work is you guys. I have tried to invent things with the different AIs just for fun. It's not really good at inventing things. It's very good at coming up with names and stuff for various
Right.
things. But it is very McLuhan-esque. If we look at the media tetrad, what does this replace and what does it bring back? This is yet another scream for the importance of real human interaction. Paul, you said we are different people ourselves, and we are with different people. It's not just external. That has to come from you, a proper philosopher. When you say it, it's obvious. It wasn't obvious to me before, because it's not that we present ourselves differently, we are differently. Going to the pub with some other parents of my child's school is not the same as who I am with you guys. I'm sure you all have similar experiences. So on that note, I would very much like to thank you all for helping to allow us to be who we are when we're in these meetings. And Paul and the rest of you, Nick, Wang, and where are you? Thritik, is that how you say your name? I'm very grateful you're here. You're welcome to come in and out. It's really important. Thritik, you were here a year and a half ago, you said, last properly, because you've had your bot a few times. Totally fine. Come and go as your schedule allows. There is no requirement in any way. So in closing, oh yeah, Fabienne, before I do my closing bit.
Yeah, it just
Give the last word, Fabienne. So
I can't help myself. I want to, but I think it's an important one that just for the anecdote, while discussing here, I was searching in my wiki, which is my personal information management, which I did play with different models with it and all. So I do think it's very interesting. But I think the number one, and for the anecdote, I looked for a piece of software that I was like, oh, I heard this before. And I found through the history of each page of my wiki that I wrote about it 15 years ago. And I was like, wow, I thought that was brand new. It was such a strange but really nice moment. So I want to encourage everybody, like, write down notes. I don't really care what you use. My suggestion is use whatever you can, LLM or not, papers, wikis, open source, closed source, but it's such, like, I don't have recommendation on how to do it. Do it however you want, but I find it such like an emotional and intellectual safety net, and it's free, like of cost. It is basically negligible. That I really encourage to do this, and with research like Paul is showing here, it's interesting to see how is it going to change and evolve over time, because what you've presented was your past work, and what's still going to come is totally open-ended. So I really recommend, again, however people do it, journaling, paper, wikis, I don't know, LLMs, literally scratch on the wall next to you if you want to, but I think it's so valuable that I really encourage people to do it.
In a way, you now manage to have the last word, because this is really important and leading to our future. Let me show you this. This is going on what you were saying there, Fabian. So as I think most of you know, in Author, you have a function where you can have a journal. And I have been kicking myself on exactly what Fabienne is talking about. Sometimes you write stuff down and you can't bloody well find it again, if you pardon my language, I'm sorry. So there are so many ways. And of course, it's easy to design a system, tag it or put it in a special folder. Very easy. But when you're in the active life, what do you do, right? So we have this thing already. We have marking. So what I'm trying to do is change the user guide, not the system. So if you have a journal and something's important, just mark it. It doesn't matter how you mark it, right? It's just that then it shows up when you skim through, right? You can see these types of things coming up, right? Point is, in our work of authorship in XR, one of the most difficult challenges we have is exactly this. And Paul, goodness gracious, I'm grateful you are here. When an author sits down to write an academic paper or anything, one of the most difficult, challenging thing is to figure out what you've written already. You know, where all those ideas you don't remember are. So when it comes to spatiality, and it's a shame that Peter's not here again today, because imagine you're able to add to what you're talking about in building, Paul, but you retrieve it spatially. So a lot of this is automatically, you know, you put on your headsets and you literally have the future in front of you, you past behind you. On the sides, you have different aspects of your life. You can have AI elements in there, which are independent LLMs to interact with the rest of the space. So, you know, let's say we're writing a paper for ACM hypertext next year. You know, we put that into the environment and our own memory, our own papers, everything we've connected can be made available to us. So the smarts, Paul, you're talking about is extremely relevant for populating XR, which is one of our interesting challenges.
Yes, absolutely. You know, I think there are plenty of opportunities there.
Sorry, I got an interruption there. It was a social thing, it was a bit urgent, and it reminds me of the importance of timing. Somebody pointed out they missed a meeting, and there you go. So on that note, thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone. And I'll say it for the millionth time, come in and out as you please. No need to stay for the whole meeting. You notice some people have left already. If you're late, you're late. Really doesn't matter. We're just very, very grateful for the community. And Paul and Mark, I hope to come down south at some point soon. Nick and Wang, you're also there. It'd be nice to see you all. All right, have a good week, everyone. Bye-bye.
Well, thanks, everyone.
Take care. Bye bye.